It was the summer of 2009 at Groom Lake in Nevada, inside the restricted range that most people choose to pretend does not exist. And at that time I was 42 years old with more than a decade spent rotating through test programs that rarely left marks on memory, and nothing about that morning announced itself as different when I parked my truck, walked past the guard shack, and felt the same dry air settle on my skin while the sky stayed clear and empty above the flat white lake bed. And I had been assigned to Hangar 4 for that cycle, with responsibilities limited to numbers, thresholds and tolerance margins where I checked sensors, signed paperwork, validated limits and watched machines behave within expectations, and the aircraft arrived before sunrise covered by tarps moving under armed silence with no markings, no tail number, and no identifiers at all, only a shape. Refused to settle when I tried to focus on it. And when ground power was connected, I tasted metal at the back of my mouth, not fear, and not nerves, just metal sharp and flat like I had pressed my tongue to foil. And beneath my boots the concrete carried a low, steady tremble, patient and deep while tools. On a nearby, cart had shifted since the night before, and no one commented on it, so I logged the time, logged the location, and told myself it was another routine test, while still stepping closer because some days announce themselves only after they have already begun. And after that first morning, routine settled into something that from the outside would have looked normal, with badge scans, long walks across concrete, that baked under midday sun, the same trailer, the same desk, the same view of the empty lake. And the program itself carried a name designed to slide off memory, labeled as Advanced Flight Systems Evaluation, because words mattered there, and nobody said Area 51 aloud, and instead we said the range or the site, and my role stayed narrow by design, since I was tasked with validating sensor data, before and after ground, runs, pressure, temperature, structural strain, and timestamps across independent systems, and I had done the same work on stealth aircraft and unmanned platforms where boredom was trusted, because boredom meant nothing was trying to surprise you. But with this aircraft, boredom never arrived, because even powered down the baseline, numbers refused rest as expected, drifting slightly overnight, not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to suggest intention, like a compass leaning without a field. And the aircraft stayed covered most of the time, and when it was rolled out, it sat low and plain, shaped to avoid attention without sharp edges or dramatic contours, and the skin was a dull gray that was neither paint nor bare metal, with panels that met without screws or rivets. And when you ran a gloved hand along the seams, you felt nothing but a shift in temperature, cooler on one side, warmer on the other, which should not happen in open air. And inside the hangar, the space felt wrong in ways I could not map, because distances measured one way felt different when walked indoors that looked square, brushed shoulders, if you were not careful, and I blamed fatigue because long hours distort perception. But still I noted it in a personal notebook instead of the official log, because experience had taught me which questions stayed quiet if you wanted to keep working. And the team itself was small, a blend of Air Force contractors and a few individuals whose backgrounds were never shared, and everyone stayed polite without much humor, and we all carried the sense of being watched, though not by cameras, but by the program itself, as if it noticed attention, and the test director kept distance, speaking rarely and clearly, choosing words with care like someone stepping across thin ice. And during the first full power ground run, the metallic taste returned stronger, filling my mouth until my teeth hummed, not painfully, but insistently, while the vibration deepened slow and even, like a massive engine turning far underground. And the instruments showed nothing out of limit, with low noise and minimal heat. So on paper it was a perfect run, but in my body it felt like standing too close to a storm I could not see, and after shutdown a pale dust clung to the lower edges of the airframe, and the floor beneath it, fine and chalky, and maintenance swept it away without comment. And when I asked where it came from, a crew chief shrugged and said the desert gets everywhere, and the answer did not fit, but I let it pass, because arguing with the desert is pointless and arguing with a classified program is worse. And at night in my bunk I replayed the numbers, because timestamps have always bothered me, and independent systems disagreed by fractions of a second before correcting themselves, which can happen with bad clocks or loose wiring. So we checked and swapped units and ran controls with other aircraft, and only this platform showed the drift always in the same direction, and always during power transitions, which suggested something pushing back and by The end of the first week, minor health issues began with headaches, dry noses, and one man experiencing a brief nosebleed during a run that medical logged as dehydration, so we drank more water and kept moving because engineers and soldiers are trained to ignore discomfort when the mission continues. And yet I noticed the birds avoided the airfield on test days, leaving the sky emptier than usual even for that place, and I began to understand we were not just testing an aircraft, but testing how close we could stand to it while it worked, because the limits were not written yet, and we were part of defining them whether we agreed or not. And each evening as I left the hangar, the vibration faded from my feet, but the metallic taste stayed until sleep, which told me the day was not finished with me. And by the second week, the aircraft stopped feeling new and began to feel familiar in the wrong way. Like a location revisited in a recurring dream, because I learned which corner of the hangar stayed colder, which lights flickered during power changes, and when the vibration would settle into my boots before the system came alive. And familiarity did not bring comfort, but sharpened what felt off. While the schedule tightened and briefings shortened with fewer questions allowed and fewer names spoken, giving the impression of work accelerating because someone was afraid of slowing down, and I spent long hours at the instrumentation racks comparing onboard sensors to external range systems, radar, optical tracking, and passive receivers, and the range that had watched thousands of aircraft struggled to see this one with radar returns shifting between clean and soft, as if the platform chose how solid it wanted to be, while optical feeds showed shape without depth, as though the air flattened the image, and none of it broke rules but bent them gently enough to remain legal, and conversations stayed shallow, focusing on weather and schedules, and dying quickly when they drifted toward the aircraft itself, until one older propulsion contractor told me quietly that the power system did not behave like an engine, but like a condition, and the next day he was gone, reassigned with his desk cleared by lunch and no explanation offered, which made the message clear, and security shifted as well, with more badge scans, escorts appearing, and phones banned entirely, even powered down ones, while medical staff increased their presence during runs, watching us more than the aircraft, which made me feel like a variable instead of a witness. So I kept my notes tighter, memorized more, and trusted paper less, and one afternoon, while running a calibration with the aircraft fully powered down, I saw the clocks drift again slightly, but unmistakably, with no power and no date, a flow, and no reason for change. And when I repeated the test, the results stayed the same, and the hangar felt quiet, though the vibration pressed faintly through the floor like an echo that never learned to leave, and I stood there staring at the fuselage with the clear thought that it was not asleep, but waiting, and health issues grew harder to ignore as headaches lingered, sleep fractured, and a young technician fainted on a night shift, waking confused, and medical logged it as stress because stress fits everything if you want it to, and the pale dust appeared more often, collecting where cleaning had just occurred, sticking to skin with a dry old stone smell that took effort to wash away. And late one evening, the test director called a closed meeting with no slides and no handouts, and told us plainly that the next phase would involve higher energy states with reduced personnel, and that risks were understood and managed. But not once did he say safe. And when I asked about clock drift and range inconsistencies, he looked at me a long moment and said some systems do not like being measured the same way twice, which was the closest thing to an answer I ever received. And walking back to my trailer that night, the desert felt wider, the stars sharper and more distant. And though my watch showed the correct time, I checked it twice and understood then the program was moving towards something it could not fully predict, and that my role was shifting from observer to someone standing close enough to record what happened when control slipped. And that knowledge settled heavy and followed me into the morning, when the next phase began without ceremony, and the hangar stood stripped to essentials, with fewer carts, fewer tools, fewer people, and the aircraft centered on the floor, as if it had claimed the space for itself, while power cables lay ready and medical staff stood farther back, and I took my place at the console, feeling the familiar weight settle into my chest. One man suffered a short nosebleed during a ground run, and medical logged it as dehydration and told us to increase fluids, and no one reacted strongly because engineers and soldiers are trained to absorb discomfort when progress continues. And still, I began noticing patterns that did not belong in routine work, like how birds avoided the airfield on test days, leaving the sky emptier than usual even for that isolated place. And slowly, it became clear to me that we were not only testing an aircraft, but testing proximity, because the real variable was how close a human body could stand to the system while it operated, and the limits were not defined yet, and we were helping define them whether we wanted to or not. And each evening when I left the hangar, the vibration drained from my feet, but the metallic taste stayed until sleep, which told me the system had not finished interacting with me. And by the second week, the aircraft stopped feeling unfamiliar and began feeling known in the wrong way, like a location from a recurring dream that you recognize instantly but never welcome. And I learned which corner of the hangar stayed colder, which overhead lights flickered during power transitions, and when the vibration would settle into my boots before the system activated, and familiarity did not bring comfort but sharpened unease, and the program schedule tightened with briefings growing shorter and questions discouraged, which gave the sense that work was accelerating because someone was afraid of pausing, and I spent long hours at instrumentation racks comparing onboard data with external range systems, including radar optical tracking and passive receivers, and the range that had tracked thousands of aircraft struggled with this one because radar returns shifted from sharp to soft, as if the aircraft decided how solid it wished to be, while optical feeds showed shape without depth, as though the surrounding air flattened perspective, and none of it broke rules, but all of it bent them carefully, and conversations stayed cautious, focusing on whether logistics and schedules and dying quickly if the aircraft itself entered discussion, until one older propulsion contractor told me quietly that the power system did not behave like an engine but more like a condition, and the following day he was reassigned without notice and his workspace cleared by midday, which communicated everything without explanation, and security presence increased with additional badge scans, escorts appearing where none were needed, and all phones banned outright, even powered down ones, while medical staff began standing closer during runs, watching us more than the aircraft, which made me feel cataloged rather than protected, and I adjusted by tightening my notes, memorizing more and trusting paper less, because documents have a way of disappearing. And one afternoon during a calibration check with the aircraft fully powered down, I saw the clocks drift again, slightly but unmistakably, with no power and no data flow, and when I repeated the test, the result held and the hangar felt silent, though a faint vibration still pressed through the floor like an echo that never learned to leave. And standing there staring at the fuselage, I realized with unsettling clarity that the system was not dormant but waiting, and health offer grew harder to dismiss, with headaches lingering longer, sleep breaking apart, and a young technician fainting during a night shift, waking confused about where he was, and medical labeled it stress because stress explains everything if you want it to. And pale dust appeared more often, collecting in areas cleaned hours earlier, sticking to skin with a dry stone smell that took effort to wash away. And late one evening, the test director called a closed meeting with no slides and no handouts, and told a small group of us that the next phase would involve higher energy states and reduced personnel on the floor, and he said risks were understood and managed, but never once used the word safe. And when I asked about clock drift and range inconsistencies, he studied me and replied that some systems do not like being measured the same way twice, which was the closest thing to an explanation anyone offered. And walking back to my trailer that night, the desert felt wider, the stars sharper and more distant. And though my watch showed the correct time, I checked it twice, and understood then that the program was moving towards something it could not fully predict, and that my role was shifting from observer to someone close enough to record what happened when control slipped, and that awareness settled heavy and followed me into the next morning when the phase began without ceremony, and the hangar stood stripped to essentials, with fewer carts, fewer tools, fewer people, and the aircraft centered on the floor like it had claimed the space for itself, with power cables already laid out and medical staff positioned farther back. And I took my place at the console, feeling the familiar weight press into my chest, and sensing that once power rose, we would be reacting rather than directing, and this phase focused on sustained power rather than brief spikes, because the goal was to hold the system at levels previously touched only in short bursts, and observe behavior over time, which on paper appeared safe because structural stress remained low. Thermal readings stayed within margins and the system produced no roar or violent motion, and yet as power ramped, the metallic taste hit, immediately coating my mouth and throat sharply enough to water my eyes, while the vibration deepened without growing louder, pressing inward like pressure inside bone rather than air, and within minutes data streams began drifting, not wildly but subtly, with timestamps slipping more than before, and independent systems aligning too perfectly for short intervals before separating again, and it became clear the aircraft was altering the environment around it. And our instruments were swimming inside that change, and I reported it, and the range lead acknowledged calmly and told me to continue logging, and his calmness unsettled me more than panic would have, and as the run continued, the air inside the hangar felt thicker, harder to move through, and lights did not dim but seemed farther away, and when I stood to stretch, I misjudged distance and struck my shoulder against the rack harder than expected, and others slowed their movements as well, testing space before trusting it, and no one spoke because speaking would make it real, and the pale dust lifted from floor, curling slowly in ways that did not match airflow, and gathered along the aircraft, skin tracing lines and edges we could not see otherwise. And for a moment the shape looked different, not larger or smaller, but more complete, like we were glimpsing something extending past the metal. And thought passed, but the image stayed, and halfway through the run, a technician near the forward section dropped to one knee, not collapsing, but avoiding standing, and medical guided him out while his eyes remained fixed on the aircraft. And later I learned he could not recall the final minutes, and that gap never closed, and the test director ordered a controlled shutdown earlier than planned. And as power stepped down, the vibration eased reluctantly, and the metallic taste lingered longest. And when silence returned, the hangar felt hollow, like sound had been taken with it. And afterward, reviewing data alone, patterns became undeniable because changes appeared before inputs were logged within margins small enough to deny yet consistent enough to track. And this was not predictive software or feedback lag, because it felt as if the system was already there, and that night security asked careful questions about my observations, my health, and my logs, reminding me gently of obligations and boundaries. And walking under the dark sky afterward, the vibration still echoed faintly in my feet miles from the hangar, and I knew then that the program had crossed a line, and what followed would not remain confined to charts or screens. And after that sustained run, the tone shifted again, with pace increasing, explanations thinning, schedules changing overnight, and tests added without full briefings, and we were told to trust the process, which usually means the process no longer trusts you. And I stayed, because leaving would have drawn more attention than staying, and because walking away felt like abandoning watch. And the next tests introduced simulated movement systems handling balance, orientation, and response, while the aircraft remained on its gear yet behaved like it was already airborne, responding to roll simulations faster than control laws allowed, and adjusting even without input, as if correcting for forces we could not measure, and machines do not compensate for what they cannot sense. And during one run, the clock stepped forward in short jumps rather than smooth drift, and I checked my own watch and felt dizziness like missing a stair in darkness, and others' rubbed eyes laughed nervously and anchored themselves to routine, while the aircraft felt closer when active, not physically, but in presence, drawing attention back without effort. And the pale dust returned heavier, tracing curves around landing gear and across the floor, unchanged by filters. And by the time the day ended, I understood we were no longer leading the tests but following them. That phase carried a feeling that once power crossed a certain threshold, none of us would be directing events anymore, and we would only be responding to them, because the focus shifted fully to sustained output rather than brief controlled bursts, and the intention was to hold the system at levels we had only brushed against before, and watch how it behaved over time, which on paper appeared conservative because structural readings stayed well within margins. Thermal output remained low, and nothing about the aircraft suggested strain or aggression. And yet the moment power climbed, the metallic taste returned with force, coating my mouth and throat sharp and invasive enough to bring tears to my eyes, while the vibration deepened without growing louder, settling into bone rather than air, and data streams began to misbehave within minutes, not wildly, not chaotically, but with subtle defiance. Timestamps slipped more dramatically, and independent systems that should never align locked together perfectly for brief stretches before drifting apart again. and it became increasingly clear the aircraft was not simply operating within the environment, but altering it, and our instruments were floating inside that alteration like debris in water, and I reported the behavior, and the range lead acknowledged with a voice that stayed calm to the point of artificiality, and told me to continue logging, and as the run progressed, the air inside the hangar felt heavier, more resistant to movement. If space itself had gained density and lights did not dim yet appeared farther away, as though the room had stretched, and when I stood to adjust position, I misjudged distance and struck my shoulder against a rack harder than expected, and others slowed their movements as well, carefully testing space before trusting it, and nobody spoke because naming the sensation would have given it weight, and the pale dust lifted again from the floor, rising in slow curls that ignored airflow and gravity and gathered along the aircraft's skin, tracing lines that revealed contours we could not see before, and for a moment the shape of the aircraft appeared more complete, not larger or smaller, but extended like an outline of something that exceeded the metal shell, and I blinked, and the thought receded, but the image stayed with me, and halfway through the run, a technician stationed near the forward section lowered himself to one knee, not collapsing, but as if his legs had simply disengaged, and medical moved in guiding him away, while he remained conscious and breathing. Yet his eyes never left the aircraft, and later we learned he could not remember the final portion of the run, and that missing time never returned, and the test director ordered an early controlled shutdown without explanation, and as power stepped down, the vibration eased slowly, reluctantly, like pressure releasing from a sealed space, and the metallic taste lingered long after, and when silence returned, the hangar felt hollow, unnaturally quiet, as if sound itself had been removed, and we stood waiting for further instruction that did not come, and afterward, alone with the data, patterns emerged more clearly because changes appeared consistently before inputs were logged within margins small enough to deny but too regular ignore, and this was not predictive software or feedback loops because nothing in the architecture supported that interpretation, and the uncomfortable conclusion formed that the system was not guessing ahead but already occupying the state we were moving toward, and that evening security pulled me aside with practiced neutrality, asking about my observations, my logs, my health, and reminding me of my obligations without threats or raised voices, and the boundary was clear, and walking back beneath the night sky, I felt the vibration faintly in my feet, even miles from the hangar, and understood the program had crossed a threshold, and whatever followed would not remain confined to screens and charts. And after that sustained run, the tone shifted again, with the pace accelerating, explanations thinning, schedules changing overnight, and tests added without full briefings. And we were told to trust the process, which usually signals the process no longer trusts you, and I stayed because leaving would have drawn attention, and because abandoning the work felt like leaving a post mid-watch. And the next series of tests introduced simulated movement systems handling balance, orientation, and response, while the aircraft remained on its landing gear yet behaved as if already airborne, reacting to roll inputs faster than control laws allowed, and making micro-adjustments even without commands, as though responding to forces we could not measure, and machines do not compensate for what they cannot sense. And during one afternoon run, the clock drift changed character, no longer smooth, but stepping forward in short increments, then pausing, then stepping again, and I checked my own watch against system time, and felt a brief disorienting wave like missing a stair in the dark, and others rubbed their eyes, laughed nervously, and anchored themselves with routine comments about fatigue or coffee. And the aircraft itself felt closer when active, not physically, but in presence, drawing attention back without effort, and making it difficult to look away. And the pale dust returned heavier, now collecting in thin curved lines around the landing gear and across the floor, and maintenance replaced filters, adjusted airflow, and found nothing changed. And by the end of that day, it was clear we were no longer leading the tests, but following them. And then one night run appeared on the schedule without explanation, drawing fewer personnel and heavier security, and the hangar felt different even before power came online, with the air cooler heavier like a storm building without wind, and the aircraft uncovered beneath hard lights looked plain and wrong simultaneously. And as ground power connected, metallic taste flooded my mouth, instantly forcing a swallow, and the vibration followed deeper than before, pressing through boots, legs, chest, until it felt embedded in bone. And this sequence skipped the gradual steps, keeping the system within controlled transition, instead climbing quickly and holding and data streams tightened into unnaturally clean lines with timestamps across systems snapping into alignment and remaining there, and for a brief moment relief surfaced because order feels safe until fear followed because systems do not behave perfectly without force, and the pale dust lifted all at once, rising in slow spirals, ignoring gravity, tracing shapes around the aircraft that did not correspond to any known structure, and a crew chief near the forward section froze, then slowly sat down speaking in flat detached phrases that carried words without meaning before blinking and returning. Confused and frightened and simultaneously, my display showed an impossible state with the aircraft registering as both active and inactive within the same window motion, and stillness overlapping distance markers flickering not as error, but as coexistence, and a wave of pressure moved through the hangar, not pushing, simply present, and for a second the room felt longer than it should have, and I steadied myself against the console and continued logging because stopping felt more dangerous than continuing, and the test director ordered shutdown with a voice tight but controlled, and the system did not respond immediately, holding its state calm and unmoving as if the command had not reached it. And then gradually power stepped down, and as it did the dust settled, vibration eased, and the metallic taste lingered, and no one spoke because we all understood something had crossed from theory into experience. And afterward the roster changed quietly, with people reassigned into distant roles and names removed from schedules as if they had never been present, and I stopped asking where they went because visibility carried risk, and instead focused on remaining useful because utility is camouflage. And security shifted from keeping outsiders away to containing us with movement. Tracked conversations monitored subtly, and medical checks increasing, framed as concern but functioning as inventory, and I realized then the aircraft was not the only subject under observation, and we were being measured for response, endurance, and adaptation. And reviewing data from that night, repeatedly the overlapping states haunted me because they implied the system carried its own rules and allowed them to bleed outward. And one contractor scientist finally spoke plainly, telling me the platform was designed not around thrust or lift alone, but around managing a boundary shaping the space it occupied, and he did not explain further. And the next day he was gone, and physically I changed, with sleep fragmenting headaches pressing behind eyes and moments where standing caused the room to lag behind me, and vibration followed me into waking hours as a faint hum in my teeth when silence fell. And once during a power outage in my trailer, I found pale dust inside a sealed toolbox and wiped it away without reporting it, and the most unsettling realization was that the aircraft responded beyond program, reacting to proximity, observation, and intent, and later ground runs showed changes in data before commands were issued, as if it had learned our habits, and that knowledge settled heavy because we were no longer guiding the test but being guided by it. And when notice came that flight testing would begin sooner than planned, fear drained into cold acceptance because this outcome had always been inevitable, and ground tests merely delayed the question of what happens when such a system leaves the floor. And walking into the hangar the next morning, I saw the aircraft waiting, quiet and patient, and understood whatever came next would not stay buried no matter how deep the desert was. One night test stood apart from the rest, not because it arrived suddenly, but because it felt like a decision already made somewhere above our level and simply handed down for execution. And it appeared on the schedule without discussion, calling in fewer personnel under heavier, quieter security. And the hangar itself felt altered before a single system powered on, because the air carried a dense, cool weight like a storm, assembling without wind, and voices echoed less than usual, while the aircraft sat uncovered at the center under hard lights, looking plain and unremarkable in outline, yet wrong in presence, like an offering pretending to be ordinary. And the moment ground power engaged, the metallic taste flooded my mouth so fast I had to swallow hard to keep from gagging, and the vibration followed deeper than any previous run, climbing through my boots into my legs and chest until it felt structural, as if it had found purchase inside bone. And this power sequence skipped the gradual steps we had always used to ease transitions, instead climbing rapidly and holding steady, and the data streams responded by tightening into lines so clean they bordered on artificial, with noise dropping away and timestamps across independent systems snapping into perfect alignment and staying there. And for a brief second relief surfaced because order reads as safety, until fear followed immediately because systems do not behave flawlessly unless something is enforcing that state. And as power stabilized, the pale dust lifted from the floor all at once, rising in slow, deliberate spirals that ignored gravity and airflow and traced shapes around the aircraft that did not correspond to any visible structure, drawing curves where no metal existed, and a crew chief stationed forward froze mid-step, then slowly sat down as if his legs had been disconnected, and medical moved toward him, but before they reached him, he spoke in short, flat phrases that carried words without intention, like labels read aloud without understanding, and then he blinked hard and looked around, confused and afraid, and at the same moment, my console displayed something I had never seen, because the aircraft registered as both active and inactive within the same window, with motion and stillness overlapping distance markers, flickering not as error but coexistence, and a wave of pressure passed through the hangar, not pushing but asserting presence, and for a fraction of a second the room felt longer than geometry allowed, and I braced myself against the console and continued logging because stopping felt more dangerous than proceeding, and the test director ordered shutdown with a voice tight but controlled, and the system did not respond immediately, holding its state calm and unmoving like it had not acknowledged the command, and only after several seconds did power begin stepping down gradually, and as it did the dust settled back to the floor, the vibration loosened reluctantly, and the metallic taste lingered like a memory of contact, and no one spoke because explanation felt impossible, and afterward the program changed without documentation as names vanished from rosters, not through discipline or dismissal but reassignment into quiet, distant roles, and their absence was smoothed over as if they had never been present, and I stopped asking because asking only sharpened attention, and instead focused on remaining useful because utility became a form of camouflage, and security shifted from guarding against intrusion to containment with movements, tracked conversations observed subtly, and medical checks increasing, framed as care but functioning as inventory, and I understood then that the aircraft was not the only subject under evaluation, because we were being measured for reaction tolerance, endurance, and adaptability, and reviewing data from that night. Repeatedly, the overlapping states refused to settle into any framework I knew because they suggested the system carried its own operating rules and allowed them to bleed outward, and one contractor scientist finally spoke plainly to me in a quiet corner, saying the platform was not built around thrust or lift alone, but around managing a boundary shaping the space it occupied, and he did not explain where the idea originated and did not need to because the implication was heavy enough. And the following day he was gone without farewell, and physically the changes in me deepened with sleep breaking into fragments. Headache pressing behind my eyes and shows where standing too quickly caused the room to lag behind me like it needed time to catch up. And the vibration followed me beyond the hangar, lingering as a faint hum in my teeth when silence fell, and once during a power outage in my trailer, I found pale dust inside a sealed toolbox and wiped it away without reporting it because I understood attention itself had weight. And the most unsettling realization was that the aircraft responded beyond programming, reacting to proximity, observation, and even intent, because during later ground runs, changes appeared in data before commands were issued as if the system had learned our habits, and that understanding settled heavy because it meant we were no longer guiding the tests but being guided by them. And when notice arrived that flight testing would begin earlier than planned, fear drained into cold acceptance. Because this outcome had always been inevitable, and ground tests merely delayed the question of what happens when such a system leaves the floor, and flight day arrived wrapped in routine, because ceremony would have drawn too many eyes, and it was logged as a limited envelope evaluation with an unmanned platform and a chase aircraft for verification, and the morning air was cold and clear with the lake bed stretched wide and empty. And I took my place in the control room, setting my headset down without putting it on yet. And my hands felt steady because my body had already learned fear here. And this was not it, and the aircraft rolled out without sound that matched motion, with no engine note to track and no blast of heat. And yet the vibration arrived anyway, spreading through the room like a tide coming in, and screens lit up clean and calm with systems green to the point of suspicion. And the metallic taste returned slowly, almost politely, like a reminder, and I swallowed and focused on the data, because trusting numbers was my role, and the taxi test proceeded as planned, if planned still held meaning, and the aircraft moved with a smoothness that made ground crew pause more than once, stopping exactly where it should and lining up on the runway with a precision that felt rehearsed. and when the takeoff sequence initiated, the vibration deepened but did not grow louder, pressing inward, and the pale dust along the runway, edges lifted and slid sideways, drawn toward the aircraft. In thin sheets, while flags showed no wind, and liftoff came far earlier than models allowed, and the aircraft left the ground flatter than expected, like lift was optional rather than earned, and load sensors showed almost nothing, while structural stress remained low and unconcerned, and that made my stomach tighten, because every aircraft pays a price to leave the ground, and this one did not. And as it climbed, range tracking began arguing with itself, with radar reporting one position, optical tracking another, and passive systems showing a soft distortion trailing behind, not exhaust, but bending of background that made straight lines look tired. And the chase pilot called visual contact, describing the aircraft as present but difficult to judge, like depth itself had been reduced, and his voice remained professional but strained. And then the aircraft turned, not sharply, not fast, wrong, pivoting through a curve that violated the envelope without registering, as maneuver and load stayed low, control smooth, and it felt as though the air had agreed to move with it. And the vibration spiked through my chest, and the metallic taste flared hard enough to bring tears, and around me people leaned forward without realizing it, and then telemetry dropped without warning, with no alarms and no cascading failures, keeping clocks running while data went silent, and seconds stretched, and I counted them without intention, and when the streams returned, they were disordered with timestamps, out of sequence, overlapping feeds, and the aircraft appearing farther downrange than it could have been by margins small but undeniable, and range safety froze, then issued abort commands, and the aircraft did not respond immediately, holding its path steady and calm like it was finishing something. And only after that pause did it turn back, aligning with the runway from a position it should not have known how to read, crossing a boundary marker, no flight plan included, and someone cursed quietly, and I logged everything with hands that did not shake, though my teeth hummed with vibration and on. Approach heat shimmer appeared where no heat should exist, folding cold air over itself, and the aircraft touched down lightly, smoothly, and rolled to a stop as if landing were incidental. And when it finally came to rest, the vibration faded slowly, unwilling to leave, and the metallic taste lingered, and no one spoke while runway crews waited for clearance that arrived too late. And as recovery teams approached, I noticed a missing marker on my screen, a panel indicator present on takeoff now absent with no alert. And when the aircraft was towed back into the hangar and lights rose, we saw it directly, because a section of skin was gone, cleanly removed, and behind it was not wiring or structure, but a smooth dark cavity, cold enough to frost its edges, melting upward. And in that moment I understood we had not merely flown an aircraft, but opened something and allowed it to move, and the response closed inward immediately, with gates locking, phones collected, and medical teams moving not toward the aircraft, but toward us, guiding us into separate rooms and telling us to wait. And I watched my console go dark and felt a sharp loss-like separation from a lifeline, and in a small windowless room, unfamiliar men asked precise questions about what I saw, what I felt, and what the data showed. And when I mentioned the cavity, one of them wrote something down without looking up and slid a statement across the table, describing the flight as nominal with minor instrumentation errors, and my mouth tasted like metal again, and I refused to sign. And one man spoke calmly about responsibility, trust, and how careers here do not end with explosions but fade. And I understood the offer and asked for time, which they allowed. And the next morning I was reassigned for health reasons, with access suspended, notes collected, and questions unanswered. And as I left the range, the vibration faded mile by mile until my teeth felt like my own again. And weeks later, in a distant office, I signed a softer statement because it was survivable, and the program continued without me, and the understanding that stayed was simple and heavy, because it was not that we lost control suddenly, but that we surrendered it politely, step by step, while telling ourselves we still held it. After the flight, the structure around the program hardened without announcing itself, and security shifted from guarding secrets to managing people with movement, logged quietly, access narrowed, and conversations observed in ways subtle enough to deny, and medical evaluations increased, framed as concern but functioning as inventory, because it became clear that the aircraft was not the only subject of study, and we were being measured for endurance, compliance, and adaptability. And I reviewed the flight data repeatedly, because the missing panel and the cavity behind it refused to leave my thoughts since it suggested the aircraft was not merely damaged but altered, as if something inside had expanded beyond the offering we had prepared, and the overlap of states active and inactive haunted every graph because it implied the system did not operate entirely within our defined framework, but carried its own set of rules that could bleed outward when conditions aligned. And one contractor scientist finally spoke plainly to me in a quiet corner, saying the platform was never designed around thrust or lift alone, but around managing a boundary shaping the space it occupied, and he did not say where the idea came from and did not need to because his eyes carried the implication, and the next day he was gone, reassigned without ceremony, and physically I felt the effects accumulate because sleep fractured into shallow intervals, headaches pressed behind my eyes, and sometimes when I stood too quickly the room lagged behind me as if time needed a moment to catch up, and the vibration followed me beyond the hangar, lingering as a faint hum in my teeth. Whenever things went quiet, and once, during a power outage in my trailer, I found pale dust inside a sealed toolbox and wiped it away without reporting it because I had learned that attention itself carried mass, and the most unsettling realization was that the aircraft responded beyond programming, reacting to proximity, observation, and intent. Because during later ground runs, changes appeared in the data before commands were issued, as if the system had learned our habits and anticipated them, and that understanding settled heavy because it meant we were no longer directing the tests but following them. And when the notice arrived that additional flight testing would continue without delay, fear drained into cold clarity because the outcome had always pointed in this direction, and ground testing had merely postponed the moment when control would be tested outside the hangar, and daily work continued under a thin veneer of routine, with reports written, meetings held, and language softened to reduce sharp edges. And I learned how to speak about what we were doing without naming it, because words carry weight and certain ones bend attention in dangerous ways, and people around me began to change subtly, moving slower, speaking less, laughing rarely, and some vanished from schedules without explanation, their absence smooth over until it felt forced, and I stopped asking because curiosity had become visible and visibility carried risk, and instead focused on remaining useful because usefulness is camouflage inside systems that prefer compliance. And one afternoon, while reviewing telemetry from the flight, I noticed anomaly I had missed before, a moment where time stamps aligned too perfectly across independent systems and then separated again, and that alignment corresponded with the missing panel location, as if the aircraft had briefly occupied a state where measurement collapsed into agreement. And the idea unsettled me because measurement is how we assert control, and perfect alignment suggested control was being imposed rather than observed. And as days passed, the metallic taste returned intermittently, not tied to active tests, but appearing near heavy electrical equipment generators, and even during storms, and medical labeled it stress response, which fit neatly into paperwork, but did not explain why my teeth hummed in silence, and why clocks sometimes seemed to hesitate before ticking forward again, and the aircraft itself remained hidden after the flight, sealed inside the hangar under layers of protocol and rumor, while modifications were discussed quietly behind closed doors. And when it emerged again weeks later, the missing section had been replaced seamlessly with no visible seam and no documentation acknowledging the change. And standing near it, I felt the same pressure as before, deeper and calmer, like something settled into a familiar posture, and ground tests resumed under tighter constraints, fewer observers, more automation, and less explanation, and revealed the same patterns: anticipation, environmental alteration, and subtle dominance over measurement. And during one run, I noticed changes in the data moments before commands were issued, not through prediction, but through presence, as if the system existed already in the state we were approaching, and I reported it carefully using language that described without accusing, and the response was acknowledgement without action, which told me the observation was not new and not welcome, and the program continued because momentum is difficult to interrupt once it gains mass. And I began to understand that what we were building was not simply a vehicle, but a method of interacting with space itself, a way to negotiate boundaries rather than push against them, and that negotiation carried consequences not evenly distributed. And the human body responded before instruments could because biology recognizes pressure long before math does, and health issues increased quietly. Headaches, memory gaps, episodes of confusion logged at fatigue and stress, and one technician broke down during a shift not from fear, but from exhaustion of pretending nothing was wrong, and medical took him away, and his name disappeared from the roster days later, and the silence around his absence felt louder than any alarm. And one evening, the test director spoke to me privately, not as an authority, but as someone carrying weight he could not set down, and said progress requires acceptance of discomfort, and that not every effect needs explanation to be managed. And I understood the subtext because management had replaced understanding as priority, and the aircraft was scheduled for further flight testing under expanded envelopes, and the chase pilots rotated more frequently than usual, which suggested reluctance, though none voiced it. And the morning of the next flight, I felt the same cold calm settle into place because fear had already done its work, and this was beyond fear. And as the aircraft lifted again, it did so with the same unnatural ease, leaving the ground without negotiation, and moving through air as if it were a suggestion rather than a constraint. And range tracking struggled again, disagreeing with itself. The chase pilot reported difficulty judging distance and closure rates, and telemetry dropped out briefly without alarms, returning with disordered timestamps, and shown displacement that should have required impossible acceleration, and abort commands went unanswered for several seconds before the aircraft complied and returned to land smoothly as if nothing had occurred. And when it rolled to a stop, the vibration lingered longer than before, and the metallic taste flooded my mouth sharply enough to make my jaw clench. And afterward, recovery teams approached with caution, and this time nothing was visibly missing, yet instruments showed discrepancies that could not be reconciled. And inside the hangar, I noticed the pale dust collecting along new lines, tracing shapes around the aircraft that hinted at geometry beyond structure, and maintenance cleaned it away, but it returned hours later. The sense grew that the aircraft was not simply occupying space, but redefining it locally, and that redefinition persisted after power, down fading slowly like heat from stone, and meetings followed filled with careful language about success and controlled anomalies. And the flight was logged at nominal within revised parameters, and statements were prepared to reflect that narrative, and I was asked again to review and sign. And this time the language was softer, allowing interpretation and ambiguity, and I signed because refusing would not stop the program and would only remove me from proximity, and proximity had become the only way to witness what was unfolding. And afterward, my access narrowed further, my role shifted toward analysis rather than direct observation. And I felt both relief and loss, because distance dulls impact, but shown distance also removes agency and life outside. The range continued narrowing into routine as I was reassigned gradually into less visible positions, and my involvement faded without ceremony. And yet the effects followed me, because the vibration lingered in memory, the metallic taste appeared uninvited, and clocks still drew my attention, and I realized the most profound consequence was not what the aircraft could do, but what it taught us about control. Because we had not lost control violently, but relinquished it incrementally while telling ourselves we were still directing outcomes, and that kind of surrender leaves no clear moment to resist. And when I finally stepped away from the program entirely, it was framed as health-related, temporary, and without impact, and I packed my things, watched the hangar from a distance, and felt a pull like leaving something unfinished, or perhaps something that had noticed me. And before leaving range, a medical officer conducted a final evaluation, asking about sleep focus, headaches, and I answered honestly, and he told me I would be fine with a tone that lacked conviction. And as I drove across the desert, the vibration faded mile by mile until my teeth felt like my own again. And weeks later, in an office far from the range, I was asked once more to sign a revised statement, softer still and survivable. And I signed because survival had become the metric, and the program continued without me. And what remained was understanding, not of a dramatic failure, but of a quiet shift where control was politely ceded and absorbed into routine, and that understanding followed me into the rest of my career, shaping how I viewed confident claims and clean narratives. Because some systems do not announce their limits, they simply move past them and keep going. Life after the program did not collapse the way people imagine when they hear stories like this, and that was the most unsettling part, because instead of ending, it narrowed quietly like a corridor, closing in from both sides, while I was reassigned into a desk role under a different command, far from test ranges, hangars, and classified flight lines, and the work became clean, dull, and procedural, filled with reports, reviews, and safety language stripped of urgency and consequence, and people treated me with a polite distance like they had been instructed how close to stand, and no one ever asked about Groom Lake or the aircraft, and that silence felt deliberate, as if an entire chapter of my service had been folded inward and sealed, and physically things stabilized without ever fully returning to baseline, because headaches came less often but stayed sharp when they did, and sleep improved. Some nights I woke with the sense that the room was wrong, like walls had shifted when I was not looking, and the metallic taste returned occasionally, usually near heavy electrical equipment during storms, or when standing too close to high voltage systems, and medical explained it as stress memory, which fit neatly into paperwork, but not into lived experience, because my teeth still hummed faintly when everything went quiet, and I learned to keep that observation to myself because quiet had become a survival skill, and friends from the range stopped calling. Some sent brief messages, careful, empty, and I understood the hesitation because staying connected carried risk and distance was protection, and I disposed of most of my old notes but kept one small notebook hidden away, not as evidence but as proof to myself, because memory is flexible and denial comes easily when reinforced by routine and news cycles filled with speculation about unidentified objects, secret programs, and blurred photographs. And I watched without reaction because what we tested was never meant to be seen clearly, and confusion was not a flaw but a layer of protection, and the aircraft did not require secrecy. To remain hidden, it only required distance, time, and enough noise to drown signal, and years passed. And I noticed that I measured rooms without thinking, counted steps, checked corners, paid attention to silence and clocks. Because once you learn that space and time can behave differently under certain conditions, you never fully inform those assumptions again, and whatever we had interacted with did not follow me home, but it left impressions rather than injuries, subtle, lasting changes in perception. And that was the true aftermath, because nothing had been damaged, but something had been altered, and that alteration persisted, quietly shaping how I responded to the world. And the program itself faded into the background of my career. Promotions arrived on schedule, evaluations stayed solid, and I learned to speak about my service in ways that skipped entire chapters without sounding evasive, which is a skill that comes with practice, because silence becomes routine if you use it often enough. And once, years later, I encountered a former coworker by chance at a conference, and we exchanged a look that carried more than conversation ever could, and we spoke about weather, travel, and retirement plans, without mentioning the range or the aircraft. And when we shook hands, I felt a faint familiar vibration, or perhaps imagined it, and I did not clarify because some confirmations carry more weight than uncertainty. And at home I kept life simple because routine helps anchor perception. And one night, during a storm when the power went out, I noticed a thin layer of pale dust on a garage shelf and wiped it away without comment, and it did not return, and I did not look for it either, because attention has weight, and I understood by then that the real consequence of the program was not what occurred inside the hangar but what did not occur afterward, because there was no public failure, no dramatic exposure, no clean ending, just a system that adjusted and continued absorbing anomalies into process. And that is how large structures survive, by not resolving questions, but containing them. And that understanding settled into me and stayed shaping how I evaluated new technology, confident assurances, and promises of control. Because some doors, once opened, do not slam shut, they remain slightly ajar, quiet and patient, waiting for the next hand to push. And I became careful with language, not out of fear, but because words shape expectation and expectation shapes behavior, and I was not interested in feeding narratives about visitors, secret wars, or cosmic threats, because what I experienced did not need embellishment to be unsettling, since it was grounded in metal, numbers, procedures, and ordinary people performing assigned tasks. And that normalcy made it harder to dismiss, because the aircraft was real, the data was real, and the effects on people were real. And what we could not agree on was what those elements meant together, and we treated the platform like a machine because that was the only framework available, and when it behaved like something more, we adjusted the framework rather than the risk. And at the time, that choice felt small, pragmatic, even responsible, but in hindsight it was foundational. And the most dangerous aspect was not the technology itself, but our confidence, because we believed measurement equaled control. And when measurements stopped aligning, we blamed tools rather than reconsidering assumptions, and curiosity carried us forward while pride kept us there. And people still ask what is really tested in the desert, wanting clean answers and simple truths. And I have none, because some programs are not about building weapons or vehicles, but about touching edges, seeing how far reality can bend before it pushes back. And sometimes it does not push, it adapts, and I remained silent for a long time because silence was expected and because speaking carelessly causes harm. But silence also has a cost because it allows others to fill gaps with noise and fantasy, and I wanted to leave something quieter behind, a record of how it felt from the inside, calm, controlled, and slowly slipping. And if there is a lesson, it is that not everything that flies is just an aircraft. Not everything that moves obeys the space you think it occupies, and not every test ends when power goes off, because some continue in memory, habit, and perception long after you leave the range. And that continuity is the true measure of impact, because it shapes how you move through the world long after official involvement ends. And as years accumulate, I find that the experience did not make me fearful but cautious and attentive, because once you learn that systems can operate beyond intent, you stop assuming that calm equals control, and you recognize that quiet is not absence but potential. And that understanding has followed me into every subsequent role, decision, and interaction. And while I never saw the aircraft again, I know it continued, because programs do not end abruptly, they transition and absorb, and what we began at Groom Lake was not concluded but folded into layers deeper. Then visibility, and the knowledge of that sits with me steady and unresolved, because some things are not meant to be closed, only carried, and I carry it still, not as a secret to protect, but as a reminder that certainty is fragile and control is often borrowed rather than owned. And the most honest thing I can say is that we did not lose control suddenly or violently. We relinquished it politely, step by step, while assuring ourselves that everything remained within limits. And by the time those limits mattered, they had already moved. With time, the edges of the program blurred into the background of my life, but they never vanished, and instead they settled into habits, perceptions, and quiet checks, informing how I moved through ordinary days. Because even after years away from the range, I found myself noticing details most people ignore, such as how rooms feel before they look, how silence carries texture, and how clocks hesitate in ways that are usually dismissed as imagination. And physically, my body adapted without healing completely, because headaches arrived less often but struck with precision when they did, and sleep came easier yet never fully deep. And some nights I woke convinced the space around me had shifted slightly, as if walls had moved when I was not looking. And the metallic taste returned occasionally, most often near heavy electrical systems during storms or power fluctuations, and doctors explained it as stress memory, which fit the paperwork but not informing, because my teeth still hummed faintly in quiet moments. And I learned not to speak about it, because quiet had become the safest posture, and friendships from the range dissolved naturally without conflict, because distance was protection, and messages grew shorter then stopped. And I understood that connection carried risk and separation was survival. And I destroyed most of my old notes, but kept one small notebook hidden away, not as proof for anyone else, but as a tether for myself, because memory bends under pressure and denial grows easily when routine rewards it, and news cycles filled with speculation about unknown craft secret tests and shapes in the sky. And I watched without emotion, because what we worked on was never designed to be seen clearly, and confusion itself functioned as shielding, and the aircraft never needed secrecy to remain hidden. It needed only distance, time, and enough competing narratives to dilute attention. And as years accumulated, I noticed that my sense of scale changed, because I measured rooms, subconsciously counted steps, tracked symmetry, and watched clocks. Because once you understand that space and time can behave differently under certain conditions, you never fully trust them again. And whatever we touched at Groom Lake did not follow me home, but it left impressions rather than injuries, subtle, durable changes in perception. And that was the true aftermath, because nothing had been broken, but something had been altered, and that alteration persisted, quietly shaping my reactions and decisions. And the program itself receded into the background of my career. Promotions came as expected, evaluations stayed clean, and I learned to describe my service in ways that skipped entire chapters without sounding evasive, which became easier with repetition, because silence grows routine if practiced long enough. And once, many years later, I encountered a former coworker by chance at a conference, and we exchanged a look heavy with shared understanding and spoke only about weather, schedules, and retirement plans. And when we shook hands, I felt a brief familiar vibration, or perhaps imagined it, and I did not clarify because certainty carries weight and doubt can be lighter to live with. And at home, I kept my life simple because routine anchors perception. And during a storm one night when the power failed, I noticed a thin layer of pale dust on a shelf in my garage and wiped it away without comment, and it did not return, and I did not look for it, either because attention has mass, and by then I understood that the real consequence of the program was not what happened in anger, but what did not happen afterward, because there was no public failure, no clean revelation, and no dramatic end, only a system that adapted, adjusted, and continued absorbing anomalies into process. And that is how large structures persist, by containment rather than resolution, and that understanding settled into me and stayed shaping how I evaluated new technologies, confident assurances, and promises of control, because some doors once opened do not close fully, they remain slightly ajar, quiet and patient, waiting for the next hand to push. And I became careful with language, not out of fear but out of responsibility, because words shape expectation and expectation shapes action, and I was never interested in selling stories about visitors from the sky or secret wars beyond reach, because what I experienced did not require embellishment to be unsettling, since it was grounded in metal, numbers, procedures, and ordinary people doing assigned work. And that normalcy made it harder to dismiss, not easier, because the aircraft was real, the data was real, and the effects on people were real. And what we failed to agree on was what those realities meant together, and we treated the platform like a machine because that was the only framework available, and when it behaved like something more, we adjusted the framework instead of the risk. And at the time, that decision felt practical, even responsible, but in hindsight, it was foundational, and the most dangerous element was not technology itself, but our confidence, because we believed measurement equaled control. And when measurements stopped aligning, we blamed tools rather than reconsidering assumptions, and curiosity carried us forward while pride kept us there. And people still ask what is truly tested in the desert, wanting clean answers and simple truths. And I do not have those, because some programs are not about building aircraft or weapons, but about touching edges, testing how far reality bends before it responds, and sometimes it does not resist, it adapts. And I remained silent for many years because silence was expected, and because careless speech causes harm, but silence also carries a cost, because it allows others to fill the space with noise and fantasy. And I wanted to leave something quieter behind, a record of how it felt from the inside, calm, methodical, and slowly slipping. And if there is a lesson, it is not dramatic, because not everything that flies is just an aircraft, not everything that moves follows the space you think it occupies, and not every test ends when the power goes off, because some continue in memory, habit, and perception long after you leave the range, and that continuation is the true measure of impact, because it shapes how you move through the world and how you evaluate certainty. And over time, I realized the experience did not make me fearful but attentive, because once you learn that systems can operate beyond intent, you stop assuming that calm equals control, and you recognize that quiet is not absence but potential, and that awareness followed me into every subsequent role, decision, and interaction. And while I never saw the aircraft again, I know the program continued, because such efforts do not end, they transition and absorb, and what began at Groom Lake was not concluded but folded into deeper layers beyond visibility, and that knowledge sits with me unresolved and steady, because some things are not meant to be closed, only carried, and I carry it still, not as a secret to guard, but as a reminder that certainty is fragile and control is often borrowed rather than owned. And the most honest statement I can offer is that we did not lose control in a single moment or dramatic failure. We relinquished it politely, step by step, while assuring ourselves everything remained within limits. And by the time those limits mattered, they had already shifted. And that is how the story truly ends, not with impact or revelation, but with continuation and adjustment and quiet acceptance that some tests do not stop. They simply change location, moving from hangars and runways into memory, behavior, and the way you measure the world long after official involvement ends. If this story stayed with you, then you already understand why some programs never make headlines and why some memories never fully fade. Subscribe to the channel and stay close, because there are more classified histories like this waiting beneath the surface. Share this story with someone who knows that silence is never empty, and comment below if you believe some aircraft are testing more than just the sky. Until next time, remember, not everything that flies is meant to be understood, and not every war leaves a battlefield.